The third intermediate period of Egypt represents one of the most complex and internally differentiated phases of ancient Egyptian history, conventionally dated from the death of Ramesses XI around 1077 BC to the Assyrian expulsion of the Kushite rulers in 664 BC. Unlike the monumental coherence associated with the Old, Middle and New Kingdoms, the era unfolded with under conditions of fragmented sovereignty, overlapping dynasties, and fluctuating centers of power. Yet it cannot be reduced to simple decline. Instead, it was a long transition during which Egypt adapted, sometimes successfully, sometimes disastrously, to new political realities. In the eastern Mediterranean and northeast Africa, following the late Bronze Age collapse, the collapse of centralized authority at the end of the New Kingdom set the structural conditions for the third intermediate period. Economic strain, loss of imperial revenues from Asia and the growing autonomy among temple institutions eroded royal power. The cult of Amun at Thebes emerged as a decisive political actor, with its high priests exercising de facto control over Upper Egypt. The bifurcation of authority between religious and royal elites created a dual system of governance that defined the opening phase of the period, and foreshadowed later fragmentation. The Twenty-First Dynasty institutionalized this division. Kings ruling from Tanis in the delta governed Lower Egypt, while the high priest of Amun controlled Thebes and Upper Egypt. Although modern historiography often treats this arrangement as a sign of weakness, contemporaries have seen it as a pragmatic compromise that preserves stability in the absence of imperial reach. Kingship ties between Tanite kings and Theban priests further blurred the boundary between secular and religious authority, allowing Egypt to avoid outright civil war during much of the early Third Intermediate period. A major transformation occurred with the rise of Libyan-descended rulers during the Twenty-Second Dynasty. Shoshenq I reunified Egypt in the mid-tenth century BC and briefly restored central control. However, this political system he established was structurally fragile. Power was distributed among royal relatives, appointed as local governors, creating centrifugal pressure that re-emerged within a century. By the 8th century BC, Egypt had again fragmented into competing dynasties, most notably the 22nd and 23rd dynasties, whose overlapping reigns produced chronic instability, especially and Middle East, in Upper and Middle Egypt. This phase revealed a defining feature of the Third Intermediate period. Kingship was no longer an exclusive or territorial absolute. Multiple rulers claimed pharaonic titles simultaneously, often controlling little more than city-states. Authority deepened less on ideological legitimacy and more on military force, temple alliances, and local loyalties. The old myth of a single divine-sanctioned ruler of the two lands persisted rhetorically, but political reality had moved decisively beyond it. The vacuum created by internal division opened the door to external intervention, most significantly from Nubia. The rulers of Kush, based at Napata, had long been culturally and religiously aligned with Egypt, venerating Amun and adopting Egyptian royal ideology. Under Pi and his successors, they presented themselves not as conquerors but as restorers of order. The establishment of the Twenty-Fifth Dynasty marked a brief but consequential reunification of the Nile Valley extending from Delta to Upper Nubia. Kushite pharaohs, particularly Taharqa, pursued an ambitious program of temple construction and other religious renewal festivals, consciously evoking the grandeur of early dynasties. Their rule coincided with renewed international engagement, but it also placed Egypt directly in the path of Assyrian expansion. The Near Eastern balance of power had shifted decisively, and Egypt no longer possessed the military or material resources to compete with iron-armed Assyrian state. The confrontation with Assyria proved catastrophic. Successive invasions by Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal exposed Egypt's strategic vulnerabilities, particularly in chronic shortage of timber and iron. The sack of Memphis and later Thebes shattered the ideology and institutional foundations of Kushite ruler. Although the Nubian kings attempted counteroffensive, their positions were untenable. By mid-1660 BC, they withdrew permanently to Nubia, ending the last phase of foreign-led reunification before Persian conquest entered centuries later. The end of the Third Intermediate Period was not a clean rupture but a managed transition. In the power vacuum left by Assyrians, Psamtik I of Sais consolidated control over Egypt through a combination of diplomacy, military reform, strategic use of religious officers, most notably the appointment of his daughter as divine adoratrix of Amun. He neutralized rival power centers without prolonged civil war. His reign inaugurated the Scythe-late period, the Scythe-late period, restoring a measure of political unity and administrative coherence. Historiographically, the Third Intermediate Period remains contentious. Some scholars question the usefulness of the term itself, arguing that it imposes an artificial narrative of decline on a period that also witnessed stability, cultural continuity, and adaptation. Chronological disputes overlapping dynasties and synchronisms with biblical and Near Eastern histories further complicate reconstruction. Revisionist theories have been proposed drastically shorter chronologies, though these remain outside mainstream Egyptology. In retrospect, the Third Intermediate Period appears less as an arbitration and more as a structural transformation. Egypt transitioned from an imperial power to a regional state, operating within a multipolar world dominated by Assyria and later Babylonia. Political authority became localized, kingship ruralized, and religious institutions assumed unprecedented political weight. These changes didn't destroy Egyptian civilizations, they reshaped it. The endurance of Egyptian culture identity through centuries of division and foreign rule underscores that the Third Immediate Period was not merely an age of collapse, but one of reconfiguration under pressure.